These are, of all of the 13 rights, sorted into 3 categories. These are the percentages of our respondents across the world who selected these rights, saying that they were affected by the pandemic. And so you can see that all of the economic and social rights were very badly affected, with the right to work being sort of a clear front runner in the stats. But you can also see that in these other categories, there were some strong effects as well. So those of you who chose arbitrary and political arrest, that certainly was one that showed a significant effect. And so was the right to assembly and association. So you can see that there was a strong effect on actually all of our rights. Now, one of the things that we're proud of at HRMI is that we're agile and we're happy to move fast to respond to things. So when the pandemic hit, we decided to include COVID-19 questions in our annual human rights survey to see how government responses to the pandemic were affecting human rights. For each of the 13 major rights we measure, we asked respondents if things had got better or worse and how much by. And we gave space for people to tell us stories of what was going on in their country. So the report is now available as a free PDF download from our website, which Cece will link to in the chat box. And Susan and I are now going to comment on some of the main themes. So Susan, early on in the pandemic, I remember, and I think I even wrote about this on the HRMI website, I remember feeling cautiously optimistic that as well as some significant encroachment on people's rights, we might actually see some improvements in some areas of human rights. Is that something that came through in our research?
Unfortunately, no. There, in fact, were many missed opportunities, I guess we could say. Let me just talk about a couple of them that our respondents noted. For example, concerning the right to education, we saw that early on, many countries provided especially disadvantaged students with tablets or computers to aid their transition to online learning. And there was a potential here or an expectation here that maybe not only would this reduce the digital divide, but that it also might enable or might level the learning playing field for advantaged, so that disadvantaged could do as well as advantaged students could do. And while in retrospect, this probably reduced learning disparities relative to what they otherwise would have been, in fact, learning disparities, it is felt, increased. And they increased for a couple of reasons. The main reason was that even though students had tablets, there were a lot of connectivity problems that especially impacted disadvantaged students. So these would be things like uneven electricity, or things like some of the students simply didn't even have access to the internet. So that was one issue. Another issue that our respondents noted was that for particular students, the online atmosphere just didn't work. And this was particularly true for students with disabilities or students that whose native language was not sort of the language in which they were being schooled. And they really needed more face time to be able to do well. So another example, I guess, would be that our respondents noted quite a lot was concerning the right to food. So many of our respondents noted that in fact, there were early on quite an expansion of food assistance programs. However, the basic problem was that the expansion was not sufficient to sort of counter the increase in food insecurity that resulted from the pandemic itself. And they also noted that another big problem was that some of the people that had access to food assistance programs in the face of the pandemic didn't, and other people simply didn't have any access to food assistance at all. So for example, some of the examples that they gave were, there were a number of students that actually relied on school feeding programs, and when school stopped, they lost their access to food through that mechanism. And also in a number of countries, respondents noted that people that were migrants, people that were undocumented, people that were asylum seekers, often they were completely excluded from any of the food assistance programs that were available.
So that's a couple of important economic and social rights. What about civil and political rights?
Yeah, there were definitely some impacts on civil and political rights noted by our respondents. And in fact, there were some interesting interactions, one might say, between economic and social rights and political and civil rights. So one of those concerned the right to housing. What we saw in some places was were some innovations that might have led, one might have hoped, towards permanently housing the homeless. And indeed, we did see some experimentation with that in a number of countries. But unfortunately, our respondents noted that in too many countries, especially as time went on, homelessness tended to be criminalized. So people who were homeless were seen as violating curfew or violating other sorts of COVID restrictions, and as a result, were subject to arrest. So that was certainly a major problem. Another issue that cropped up from that our respondents talked about concerned prison population. And we saw some things that many people celebrated as great progress early on, where we saw political prisoners released, we saw low-level offenders released. But actually, as the pandemic wore on, our respondents noted that increasingly people that were homeless, people that were protesting, people that were migrants, people that criticized the government in some way, they were increasingly subject to arrest. So as a result, we found that the prisons filled right back up. So basically, I guess we'd say instead of improvements, what we really saw was just a really wide range of increased violations. In fact, in terms of the violations that we observed, it might be useful to look at a couple of slides here, and we can look at them by our broad categories of rights. So what you're seeing here is safety from the state, and this shows us the respondents, sort of a summary of responses from each country, and it shows how those respondents rated the negative impact of the pandemic. So we see here for safety from the state, basically the responses were all the way from very little effect to somewhere between things got worse or much worse. There was, however, one country where one might say the typical view or the most likely view was that there was no impact and possibly even a slight improvement. Okay. If we move on to then the empowerment rights, which should be the next slide, there we go. Okay. We see the pattern is fairly similar. That is, we go from effectively no effect all the way down to between worse and much worse. However, the countries that are along the top, the order of that has changed quite a bit. And the other thing for empowerment rights we see here is that there is no country where one might say there is a reasonable prospect of really no effect or anything getting better. So that was so you might say that empowerment rights fared a little bit worse than safety from the state rights, if you kind of look at it that way. Mm-hmm. And now let's take a look at the quality of life rights. And here we see the impact was actually far greater than for the other two big categories of rights. And one of the things that really struck me is if I look at where the black lines are representing what we think the best case scenarios based on respondents' answers is, what we think the most likely impact was, negative impact was. And we see that, in fact, over half of them, half of the countries were rated, the respondents rated things as getting worse to much worse. So that was even worse than we saw in the other case, in the civil and political rights.
And I guess I'll emphasize that all of those graphs, which we just showed you fleetingly, and in small type, you can see them for yourself in the COVID report, which is linked to in the chat. And if you also make sure that you download the appendix, we have country by country graphs, so you can see not just the sort of average responses across all countries, but you can see exactly what people who are experts on your country, if you're in one of those 39, what they said.
So Taya, let me ask you a question now. Was there anything when you looked at the report and you saw what respondents said, Is there anything that particularly struck you?
Yeah, I mean, I found it really useful to read through the responses and see the data. I think the thing that really struck me was the vast range of ways a right could be impacted and how different that was in different countries. I remember reading the data for the right to food first, I think, and seeing it laid out in black and white, the very many different ways that government action or inaction could mean that people were going hungry. For some examples, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, agricultural production went down and that had an effect on food supply. In many countries, of course, there was an economic downturn that affected food security. In some places like Brazil, DRC, Samoa and Venezuela, people reported that not only did incomes go down because of the economic downturn, but also food prices went up. There were also transport chain problems reported in Cook Islands. And in some countries that had lockdowns, which most of the world at some point, but reported in the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Liberia, and Nepal, people reported difficulty accessing food because of the movement restrictions, particularly for vulnerable groups like people with disabilities. Also in Maui Nui, in French Polynesia, and in Guam and in New Caledonia, lockdown rules prevented access to traditional food gathering practices. So the situation was clearly very complex. And I think that's a lesson that we hope governments learn as the whole world continues to navigate this pandemic. Governments need to consider more carefully the unintended consequences of their perhaps well-intended public health measures. Governments were violating people's rights, it seems to me, in ways they sometimes didn't plan on, and they weren't always responsive enough to changing things. But speaking of good intentions, Susan, what do you think? Were all the rights violations we tracked just things that we all have to live with if we're going to get through COVID? What did you observe?
No, according to the respondents, that definitely was not the case. As a matter of fact, quite a number of respondents told us that they felt that the governments had used the pandemic sort of as an excuse to crack down, especially on arbitrary arrest and torture and ill treatment increased as a result of the crackdowns due to what they thought was due to the pandemic. So let me just show you some countries where we thought that was true. So, or where respondents indicated that was true. So if you look at safety from the state, what we found was that our respondents from Australia, Hong Kong, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Venezuela, Papua New Guinea, Jordan, Nepal argued that the crackdown actually increased arbitrary arrest unnecessarily. And our respondents further stated that another problem was that because of the emergency, the states of emergencies that many of these countries issued, it was really impossible to protest these arbitrary arrests. Our respondents also reported that torture and ill treatment increased over what they otherwise would have been as a result of the pandemic, in other words. And there were quite a number of countries, even a much larger list of countries where they felt this to be true. And that included Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Papua New Guinea, Taiwan, Venezuela, Nepal, Liberia, Fiji, Jordan, Malaysia, Australia, and New Zealand as well. So
yeah, that's quite a list. You focused on two safety that's from the state rights there. Was it the case that enforced disappearances, that extrajudicial executions, were they fine?
No, they weren't fine, but they were less common. So what we saw is we had our respondents from Kazakhstan and from Venezuela said that the pandemic appeared to be offering cover for enforced disappearances that the government sponsored. And perhaps even worse, our respondents from Venezuela stated that any healthcare workers who provided COVID-19 statistics that differed from what the government was putting out were at greater risk of extrajudicial execution even. So that was kind of stark to me.
Yeah. And we saw earlier that safety from the state was not the category that had the strongest effect. So what about empowerment rights?
Yes, we can also look at the empowerment rights, and what we see is that the rights to assembly and association were highly affected, as were opinion and expression. And there's a number of reasons that these rights were impacted. So, for example, with regard to assembly and association, yes, they said that the pandemic was used as an excuse to crack down on that. But they also argued that many countries issued restrictions that were imposed much longer than necessary. So it need not have been as difficult as it was for many people. So, for example, those that specifically mentioned that the restrictions were imposed longer than necessary were Taiwan and the United Kingdom. On the other hand, quite a number of respondents from quite a number of countries indicated that these restrictions were quite unevenly enforced. So respondents from Brazil, Kazakhstan, Australia, the United States, French Polynesia, and Jordan said that the restrictions were unevenly enforced, so that what they observed was that sort of assembly and associations that in some way were supportive of the government were permitted, but those that were in any way critical of the government were prevented. And in terms of opinion and expression, again, many of our respondents said that this was often used, the pandemic was used as an excuse to impose those restrictions. So that was the case in, for example, Angola, Brazil, Jordan, Malaysia, Nepal, Taiwan, Tonga, and the United States. But also felt many countries, many respondents noted that in their countries, the restrictions on opinion and expression were simply unnecessarily broad.
So what about political participation, which was the one that was least affected according to our respondents? Does that mean that countries kind of got some things right, or what went on there?
Well, there were fewer complaints about that. There were fewer responses about that, but there were some. And basically what those responses said is that there were opportunities for political participation to have been impacted less than they were. So some of the specifics that were mentioned was, for example, respondents from the United States said there were actually practical adaptations that could have been made that would have expanded the ability for people to participate in voting. As I recall, in Kazakhstan, what respondents said was that there was some election tampering with the online voting, and there could have been some very simple measures taken that would have prevented that. In addition, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Hong Kong, Mexico, and Taiwan, respondents noted that there were certain public health measures that were not taken, and that the fact that those public health measures were not taken actually jeopardized participation to vote on the part of many.
Thanks, Susan. That's a really helpful introduction to some of the big themes and big findings in the COVID report. So just a reminder that the data we've been referring to is all in the report that you can download from our website. The